Hello everyone, my name's Aaron Christensen and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, celebrating classic horror throughout history with new episodes every Friday night. Tonight we're going to be celebrating one of the true icons of cinema, a film that truly requires no introduction, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho from 1960, starring Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, Vera Miles, and Martin Balsam. The film was a smash hit with audiences and literally changed the face of both cinema and horror forever. Its legacy stretches far and wide, all the way into the slasher boom of the 1980s. It all started with the Bates Motel in 1960, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho.
The past is never really past. It stays with me all the time. And no matter how hard I try, I can't really escape.
You dirty little pig!
Sometimes, when she talks to me like that, I feel I'd like to go up there and curse her and leave her forever. Or at least defy her.
His mother was a clinging, demanding woman. And for years, the two of them lived as if there was no one else in the world.
What do you think?
Then she met a man.
We're going to get married. He's also going to live here, in my house.
You make respectability sound disrespectful.
Let's all talk about marriage, shall we? When he met your sister, he was touched by her, aroused by her. He wanted her.
Thank you, Mr. Bates.
Norman Bates.
That set off the jealous mother, and mother killed the girl.
Let's just say just for the sake of argument that she wanted you to gallantly protect her. You'd know that you were being used, that you wouldn't be made a fool of, would you?
But I'm not a fool.
Well,
And I'm not capable of being fooled, not even by a woman.
It's all too obvious. Our courts protect the criminals, not their victims.
You know what I think? I think that we're all in our private traps, clamped in them, and none of us can ever get out.
When he murders again, you will be directly responsible.
We scratch and claw, but only at the air, only at each other. And for all of it, we never budge an inch. It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
It's been 65 years of stinging strings, dragging swamps for cars, and all going a little mad sometimes. We're here to talk about Psycho, and we have an amazing panel to chat about it with me. Let's bring everybody in, and let's say hello to Doug Long.
A boy's best friend is his mother.
Christiana Benedict.
I have the heart of a small child. I keep it in a jar on my desk.
Rob Galuzzo.
Hello, hello.
Mackenzie Parker.
Hello.
Matthew Amador.
Hey there, just like the other Matthew Amador, but now I'm in color.
And we are here to chat about Psycho 1960, celebrating its 65th anniversary. And along the way, we'll be chatting about the entire Psycho legacy, which includes Psycho 2 from 1983, Psycho 3 from 1986, Psycho 4, The Beginning, 1990, and the Gus Van Sant remake, 1998. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. And just to go and make this clear, we will be talking spoilers for a 65-year-old movie, but we'll also be talking spoilers for other iterations of that story. So just be advised, we're going Psycho. Let's dive in. This is such a great panel. We have Doug. I know you teach a class on Hitchcock at DePaul University. Rob, you are the director of the documentary, The Psycho Legacy from 2010. Let's go ahead and just kick things off with how you came to the original Psycho for the first time. Matthew, do you mind if we kick things off with you?
It's similar to Psycho. My mom introduced me to this. So there is a theme right there, a through line. I saw it as a kid. I fell in love with it. I became a fan of Alfred Hitchcock because of that at a very young age. I made a sweatshirt for my grandmother that was the Hitchcock profile on a sweatshirt, and then I attached a little music button so it would play the funeral march.
Oh, wow.
I don't know how great it is to give an elderly woman a shirt that plays the funeral march, but I was there, so I was hooked. And I dressed up as Norman Bates as mother for Halloween when I was 15.
Wonderful. See, I knew you had a strong tie to this one.
Very much so.
Mackenzie, how about you?
Psycho to me is like I don't remember a time before Psycho, and it's like the Wizard of Oz of slashers, where it's like I don't remember ever not knowing kind of what was going on in that movie. But the big impact for me was when I was 8. We went to Orlando, Florida, and we went to Universal Studios, and they had an exhibit where they were of just Hitchcock movies, and they were talking about like the tricks and the trade that went into it, like a lot of the special effects, the camera tricks, and things like that. I was really dazzled by that as a kid. We bought this big Hitchcock box set, and we just like burned through it as a family. And that's origin for me for my love of movies and everything else. So
awesome. Jump up to you, Doug. How about you? Where did you come to the original Psycho?
As a kid on a black and white TV in my bedroom, my cousin had a high school film class and they had studied it. So he gave us cliff notes throughout the movie.
It's the original audio commentary.
That's right.
Christiana, how about you?
I saw it with my mother too. She showed it to me sometime in the 1970s, it would have been the late 70s, I think. And I remember that for reasons that I'll get to later. Hitchcock has always been there in my cinema life. I mean, I remember when the quote unquote forbidden Hitchcocks came out in the 1980s. Me and some of my high school friends rented all of them and watched them.
Rob, you did the documentary. I'm guessing this film made an impression, the franchise made an impression. What was your intro to Hitchcock, Psycho, etc.?
Well, like a lot of people here, I don't remember specifically the original Psycho when I had seen it. It just feels like it was always there. I started very young as a lover of the Universal monster movies, and so I just think I always loved anything to do with horror, Universal, black and white film, etc. But I was fortunate that I grew up in the 80s, the VHS era, and I rented. And again, back then, before Blockbuster, they were a little more lax about letting you rent stuff when your parents weren't around. So I had a dude with a mohawk at the local video store that would let me rent anything. And I remember the sequels. The sequels were really more what tied into my love of getting into the horror genre, was when the sequels were prominent. And I just remember catching a glimpse of part 3 and it like terrifying me. And there was also, I don't know if everyone remembers, but there was also this thing that I think Fangoria sponsored it called the Horror Hall of Fame. And they did like 3 years of it. And basically they did these cool little, like maybe 10-minute featurettes on classic films where they would talk to everybody involved. And I just remember that was really, it was, that was kind of getting a 10-minute jolt of how Alien was made and Psycho and all the classics was really incredible. And over the years, I loved all the franchises, but Psycho I always kept coming back to because I just thought it was the most real. Norman Bates was the most real character. I mean, Freddy and Jason are cool, but they're fantastical. And also I think it was that same special where Robert Englund referred to him as the Hamlet of horror. And that's the thing. Like Norman Bates has this, like, he's the one horror icon that's like Shakespearean and just full of tragedy through every single movie. So it's always been my favorite. And obviously my obsession led to making a documentary about the sequels. So yeah, it's just always been there.
Well, and kind of to, echo what other folks have said, I remember becoming acquainted with Norman Bates and the shower scene and things like that via like Halloween clip shows where they would talk about, favorite horror moments back in like the 70s. And so I don't know that I ever had an opportunity for it to be a twist ending or a surprise. I think much like Jekyll and Hyde, the Robert Louis Stevenson novel is a mystery. You don't find out until the end that they are the same person. And I think the same was true, is that by the time I came to it, we all knew that Norman Bates was a killer. Whether it was his mother or not, whether mother persona or not, we knew that Norman Bates was not a good dude to hang out with. I remember seeing those clip shows and immediately going, what is that? Like just seeing the shower scene alone, you go, that's unlike anything I've seen. Much like you, Rob, I was a fan of classic monster movies. And, the shower scene versus Frankenstein is quite a different kettle of fish. I think when talking about Psycho, because it looms so large, it's kind of like, where do you even begin to talk about it? I realized that I hadn't seen the movie itself in quite a while, just because I feel like it's always been there in my head. Like I went back and watched the sequels first, and then I said, you know what? I probably should just watch the original film as well so that I can get refreshed. And what a great journey it is. Like just as a straight narrative, it's just a terrific, well-told story. But I suppose going back to that is we have the original Robert Bloch novel, which is what was adapted by Joseph Stefano. And Doug, when you're talking about this at your class at DePaul, how do you kind of kick things off in terms of introducing students to Psycho?
Well, one is within Hitchcock's career at Paramount, which was a very happy time for him. You know, he had Technicolor, big stars, Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Grace Kelly, really everything he wanted. But under his contract, he had one more movie to do. And this is what he submitted. And they thought it was horrible. And they said, no way. And so we really see the most mainstream of directors going pretty indie at the height of his career, using his TV crew to get it done.
He paid most of it most of it himself too.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons he wound up with sort of the ownership of it, and why he was able to take it to Universal, which is the studio we most associate Psycho with these days. Part of that is because Psycho made Hitchcock so much money, he plowed it all into MCA stock, which enabled him to buy the rights to some of his other movies. And for that matter, he was also offered the ownership of Universal at one point.
How many of you were familiar with the Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV show?
Oh, sure.
Prior to seeing Psycho, or perhaps in conjunction with?
You know, with the TV show, at that point, he was just a personality that everybody in America knew. The first director who was like that. And beloved too, if you remember, he did the intro and outro to each show, always comically. And most of his movies during the era of that TV show had quite a bit of humor. The movie just preceding this is North by Northwest, tons of humor. And then this is, despite the fact that Hitchcock called it a black comedy, pretty devoid of what we think of as humor.
Yeah, even the trailer for this movie, I feel like he was borrowing a page out of William Castle's book in terms of the ballyhoo. When we're talking about the novel and the adaptation, the novel starts off introducing Norman Bates. Does anybody want to speak to that?
I read the book for the first time actually during quarantine. I realized I'd never read the book before, and I love that opening chapter because it sort of tells you where this is going, because he's reading, like, is it a National Geographic in that first chapter, and he's reading about a tribe that will take their dead and make drums out of their bodies, and then like the resonant sound comes out of the mouth of the corpses. And I was like, that's such a fascinating image to put in your reader's mind just before telling this story, because he's kind of telling you what it is before telling you what it is,
Right.
And I thought that was such a cool way to start, and that like surprised me so much. I love that opening chapter.
And the novel, of course, is inspired by the real life persona of Ed Gein.
He said he may have been influenced by it subconsciously, but it did happen, like, I think, 40 minutes, I think, from his house. That's where Ed Gein was arrested. One thing that I think is fascinating in terms of this piece as a work of adaptation is the characterization of Norman in the book versus him in the movie. In the book, he's middle-aged and much more burly.
He's like the guy that turns out to be the Zodiac in Zodiac, that actor. Like, that's probably more what Norman Bates would have looked like if they were casting it accurate to the book. I think it really works because I love the unassuming nature of a Tony Perkins, and like, just doesn't even, it doesn't cross your mind if you don't know. He's so charming.
Yeah, he's described as 40 and overweight and glasses and things like that. And we start off with Norman. Like you said, that's the opening chapter. So it feels like it's Norman's story from the get-go. Maybe we're going to have, Mary and Norman, and they'll meet, which they do. But what happens in the adaptation is we don't meet Norman for nearly 30 minutes. which very much Marion Crane's story.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about the versions of Norman in the book versus the movies and why some of these decisions happen. And I understand them. I'll preface by saying that I love the Bloch books because it just feels like this alternate timeline of really crazy stories that he takes this character. Once Hitchcock made Psycho what it was, and because it's so different from his book, I feel like Bloch probably had a love-hate relationship with this creation. And I mean, Psycho 2, the novel, is intended to be unadaptable. Like, there's no way you could have made a movie from that. But what I think is interesting, and maybe it's Hollywood thinking from 1959, 1960, is, okay, if we're going to have this character and we're going to, you know, take you on this journey, then we need this person to be as unassuming and attractive as possible. We want the audience to really get behind them. And that's kind of the magic trick of that movie, right? Is that once it shifts gears, I've heard so many people say that, like, when he's getting rid of the car and it like starts to sink and freezes, people immediately panic for Norman. And I don't know if that would have happened if it wasn't somebody as attractive as Anthony Perkins. Concurrently to that, I spoke to David Scow quite a bit for my documentary, and he was very good friends with both Bloch and Joseph Stefano. And so his insight was, when Stefano had thought a lot about this, and by the time we get to Psycho 4, even though Mother is depicted as kind of an old woman, Stefano probably thought, you know what, we should make Mother as attractive a person as Norman was when we met Norman. And that's why in Psycho 4, it's Olivia Hussey, and there's a line of dialogue where he says, she grew old in my mind. And that's why he hears her the way he does. So I think it's interesting. And even more so, I chatted with Chet Williamson, who was the author of Psycho Sanitarium, which is the direct sequel approved by the Bloch estate for Psycho. So it takes place between Bloch's Psycho 1 and 2. And in the conversations on the Arrow Blu-ray, you can't separate Anthony Perkins from that character. So I asked him, what did he do to write the book version of Norman? And he said, I imagined him as Vincent D'Onofrio. That's how he's described in the original. And I just thought of him now in an institution, and that was how I kept Norman, the book version of Norman. So I thought that was fascinating. And if they made a proper adaptation, he would be an incredible actor to play that version of Norman.
We got that in The Cell.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I have absolutely no documentary evidence for this, but I'm absolutely convinced that Norman, as you see him in the movie, is modeled on Cornell Woolrich, because Woolrich in real life was a homosexual, had a very codependent relationship with his mother, very unhealthy. And Hitchcock knew Woolrich's work really well. Obviously, he directed Rear Window from Woolrich, and there are like a dozen Woolrich stories sprinkled out through Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And Hitchcock directed 3 O'Clock for Suspense, and that was only like a year before Psycho was made. When you suggested that we take a look at the Bates Motel TV show, the first episode of that show is titled First You Dream, Then You Die, which is the title of Cornell Woolrich's autobiography. So obviously, somebody else out there has the same life.
So. We'll talk more about Anthony Perkins and what a terrific performance he lends. But I think it does start with Janet Leigh and us identifying with that character, Marion Crane.
Well, when Hitchcock was interviewed many times, of course, about this film, he often talked about what attracted him most was the idea of surprising the audience by killing off the star early, that they wouldn't expect it. I think she does a tremendous job in this, too. She's, of course, as you know, the only actor of the cast to be Oscar nominated for it. I think both she and Perkins, they give excellent two of the best Hitchcock performances, and I see it. The whole thing is a very sad story. I know some people see it as a delightful thrill, but her life, Marion's life in this movie, is truly dead end in every way. The money she steals is not for a thrill; it's because Sam won't marry her otherwise. And I think she really just embodies this character, and you buy that that's why she's there. And then in the parlor scene, that she really makes this decision to turn things around and cleanses herself, both spiritually and physically, in the shower for a few moments at least.
That's right.
I love her performance in the movie. I always think about the part. It's like one of my favorite interpretable moments in the movie is when she's imagining all the voices of like the people that she's screwed over as she's going along. Like there's that moment where she almost smiles when the guy says, "Even flirted with me," and I always think about that because it's like, what does that smile mean? Is she are these conversations all in her head, or are they real conversations that are actually happening? And B, like, what is that smile about? And I love thinking about it. I love that performance.
Mackenzie, there's a scholar named Robert Kolke who wrote an article and talks about 3 key smiles in this film. That's one of them. Of course, Mother's permanent smile, and then naturally Norman's smile at the end.
Well, it's a bit of a misdirect, isn't it? For those who may not have been familiar with the novel, even though it was a success at the time, if they weren't familiar with that, you're going into that thinking, well, who is the psycho? Are we? Is it the person who is having conversations in their mind? Is she the psycho? In a way, this reminds me of the movie Carrie, in that every time I watch Carrie, that performance by Sissy Spacek, I always hope, I'm like, maybe this time I'm going to see an alternate ending.
Right.
Maybe this time they'll get out of it. Maybe it'll work. And I feel the same way with Jen Lee's performance here as Marion Crane. I think maybe, you know what? Maybe this kid just figured it out. Maybe she's going to get away this time. And it breaks my heart when she does it.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think is really terrific is kind of the mirror images, and there's mirror imagery throughout the film. With Ed Gein, one of the great tragedies about it was that people knew this man. He did handiwork for them. He even babysat for them. It was somebody that they thought they knew, and yet also had this darkness inside. And I think that's what when we think of Marion, like, nobody can believe that she did this. They're like, no, I can't imagine Mary would steal this money. She's a good person. She wants a good life. And the same thing is true of Norman, right? We see Norman and we think this is a handsome, charming, he's taking care of his mother, like that's a good boy. But inside there's something deeper and darker. And I think that's one of the things I love, is that these two characters really do mirror one each other in terms of they do things that you would not expect them to do.
What's interesting about Marion, and in particular how good Janet Leigh is in that original movie, that character is carried over into every sequel. Like her presence is just as important in 2. And because that's one of the main plot twists of 2. 3 is all about a character that looks like her. It's just interesting to think like that literally is the two sides of the coin are Norman and Marion, and it kind of carries through the whole franchise.
We also have the characters of, the motel for one thing, but also that house up on the hill. Those have become just kind of iconic images. The fact that they are instantly identifiable. Like on this new Arrow box set, there's just the silhouette of the house and everybody knows that's the Psycho house. But we also have some really strong supporting actors in the form of Vera Miles, John Gavin, and Martin Balsam.
I'll jump in on Martin Balsam. I think his is also one of the best Hitchcock performances in any of his films. As Arbogast, he's got a cynicism right at the beginning, and yet he is unknowing, a total victim when he bites the dust, and we are with him all the way up the stairs.
When he first shows up, I always every time get this feeling of like, oh God,
right,
it's so annoying. But like he ends up being so helpful, and he's so kind to Vera Miles, and it's like, and that scene with him and Norman is one of that scene needs to be studied in like acting classes. I don't know why that scene doesn't come up more in like theater training, because like that tension that those two actors hold, where they're just like that whole like, did you stay the night with her? How'd you know she didn't make any phone calls? All that stuff is like, man, it's so good. And I read the crew actually applauded after they did that scene. I think Vera Miles is also underrated as the star of this movie. Like she carries it after the death,
I know that there was a bit of contention between her and Hitchcock because she was supposed to be, I think she was supposed to be the lead of, I want to say The Birds. Vertigo. That's correct. And she got pregnant, and this is all Hollywood gossip. Who knows how much of it is accurate, but I believe most of it. She's great in the original Psycho, I think she's just as good in the second one. I mean, she's a big part of why that second movie works as well as it does. And just to go back for a second to Martin Balsam, Psycho was my introduction to him. And then, you know, I'd see him in things like Death Wish 3 and be like, oh my God, I love that guy. He is a terrific actor. And that scene that you mentioned is one of the finest examples of acting ever. Stuart Gordon is in Psycho Legacy, and he was a huge Hitchcock fan. He had worked with Anthony Perkins. Anthony asked him to do Psycho 4, and he just said he couldn't. And Stuart had said, he's like, I don't think there's a finer piece of acting than Anthony Perkins and Martin Balsam. And he said he asked him a lot about it. And what makes that scene unique for that time period, which you don't see in other movies, is they interrupt each other a lot, which was kind of a big no-no at that time period. But they asked Hitchcock, can we do it this way, where basically they kind of interrupt and stumble over each other? And that's why they got applause, is because it was something that wasn't really the norm for films at that time.
It's a beautifully filmed scene as well. You know, as Norman gets more nervous, the camera goes below him, and we get this really interesting low angle.
Yeah, where he kind of is peeking over at the register, and you get that big shot of his neck, basically. Yeah. And I was reading somewhere that they were kind of playing upon Anthony Perkins as a bird, like, you know, a lot of bird-like imagery, kind of going along with his taxidermy proclivities, but that they wanted to play on his chicken-like neck. And so they really just put it front and center. Really, this film rests on the shoulders of Anthony Perkins. He is top billed. I would say across the series, as you said, Rob, we wouldn't have Psycho as a franchise or as a movie without Anthony Perkins' performance. And it is all sorts of colors that he uses.
One thing that's amazingly different about the way that he paints, we're talking about colors, the way that he paints with his performance in this movie, is you have Janet Leigh, who a lot of her work is solitary. A lot of her work is just seeing internal monologues as she's staring to the camera, or she's having moments by herself. So many of Anthony Perkins' stellar scenes, I mean, yes, there's him at the final scene where it's his own internal monologue and you have that amazing smile. So much of it is him playing off of other people, whether it's him playing off of the voice of Mother in his head, but also John Gavin, 3/4 of the way through, almost towards the end, when John Gavin is just grilling him and you see physically his change. He's physically changing and he's flustered, and it's almost like bully and a social outcast at school. You see these dynamics play out. By this point, you know that he is not what he seems, yet still he is so, there's a vulnerability to him. Gosh, I think it was Agatha Christie who said that she writes her villains as if they're the heroes.
Mm-hmm.
And something that Hitchcock is really great at doing is giving humanity to these people that you otherwise would vilify, especially in Hollywood at this time. You're not going to have necessarily villains with shades of gray. You really start to care about him. And yeah, his work here is fantastic. I will say, as we talk about some of the future sequels, meta-knowledge tinges that for me a bit. It makes it a little bit more heartbreaking in a different way. But seeing him here when he is just starting out in Hollywood, and you see him really, really flexing as much as he can, I mean, he just knocks it out of the park.
Similar to Robert Bloch, you know, I think he had a love-hate relationship with this character. He very deeply wanted to break out of the teen idol kind of stuff that he was doing before this movie, and then this really just, he couldn't escape it. And I think there is, I don't know, a 10, 15-year gap where he really didn't even want to talk about it. And my understanding, and again, I'm paraphrasing, so I don't know if this is all correct, but I think he did an appearance on Saturday Night Live where they did some sort of Psycho spoof. It's on YouTube, and it was Dan Aykroyd who's like, you really should play that character again. And I don't know why that's the reason it stuck, but I think it was just timing, and all of a sudden Psycho 2 came around. I think he eventually, especially by the time he directed the third one, came to terms with that this is who he's going to be known forever for, so we might as well embrace it and take advantage of it. But then he had people representing him that really steered away from it. I think it was the Horror Hall of Fame, or it might have even been the Fangoria appearance that is on Psycho Legacy. But Tony Timpone had told me that he had asked him to come to a show, and his people said no. And then I don't know exactly how, but he got in touch with him directly and he was like, yeah, I'm more than happy to. So I think there was a period where if you got to him, he was humble about it, but he kind of had people around him that even were trying to separate him. So much so that there's a comic book adaptation from, I think, 1990 from Innovation Comics. And I talked to that artist because it is literally like this beautiful painted portrait shot for shot of the Hitchcock movie. And yet Norman looks like the book version. And it always, as a kid, threw me off. I'm like, I don't understand this. And the artist told me that he drew it as Anthony Perkins. And right before they went to press, the Perkins estate objected to his likeness. And so he had to go and repaint only the Perkins parts. Now, again, I don't think he would have cared because he did the 4 movies. I always wonder if the Perkins likeness thing is still an issue because I have a lot of goodies here, but I have the first Arrow release of Psycho 2 here. And as you can see, it's all silhouettes. It's not I don't know if they can get away with using Perkins likeness anymore.
Christiana, anything you want to say about Tony Perkins?
His Norman reminds me a little bit of the ball player he played in Fear Strikes Out. Who, if you've never seen the film, the ball player in question is struggling with bipolar disorder, manic depression. I think that between those two, you sort of see like two sides of the same sort of performance. And on one, you have this character that overcomes his mental illness, and then you have Norman who does not. I also like the way that the image of Tony Perkins as Norman Bates is sort of exploited in Pretty Poison. He plays a character that is sort of similar to Norman, but he's a lot sweeter. He's not a murderer. He's an arsonist. And they contrast him with Sue-Ann Stepanek, played by Tuesday Weld, who is completely bananas. It works really well. It's probably my favorite Perkins performance other than Norman. I feel bad for Norman every time I see the film. I sympathize with him when the car stalls, when it's sinking into the marsh. I understand that he's about to vomit when he's cleaning up after Mother. It's a great performance, making a character pretty real.
I think it was Matthew who was saying before, it's like every time I watch any Psycho movie, I always wish it'll end differently. Like that's how much I love Norman, is every time we go in, I'm like, this might be the time. Nope.
I mean, that all said, I do have a complication. I have a complicated relationship with the Norman and Mother dynamic, and with some of the politics of the images in Psycho, because I am a transgender person, and this is the genesis of the transgender psychopath in popular culture. And the daughters of Psycho are absolutely legion, and they start almost immediately with William Castle's Homicidal, and then you continue on through like Brian De Palma and Silence of the Lambs and a number of other films. And I had mentioned earlier that I remember seeing Psycho in the late 70s because I had seen a transgender psychopath in the early 70s on the streets of San Francisco, played by John Davison. I mean, the film, and it sort of explains it away. He's not really a transvestite or whatever, but the image trumps the text. And the image of a man dressed as a woman invading a bathroom to do harm to a woman when she's the most vulnerable is an animating force in politics right now. Mm-hmm. And so it complicates my relationship with Psycho and with Norma. I don't think it really tarnishes the movie, which, really didn't intend any of that, but unintended consequences are still consequences.
I'm glad you brought that up, Christian, because I agree. I think that Norman and his mother, it's not Norman dressing up as a woman. It's not Norman trying to be female. It's Norman and his mother, who, is female inherently. That's what he's working with. But I can see, the optics are, it's Norman in a dress murdering somebody.
Yeah.
I hear you with that, Christiane. I work with a lot of trans folks in my therapy practice, and it's something that we talk about a lot, representation throughout history in movies. And even if you have something like this, which does get explained away in a monologue at the end by probably
Simon
one of
Oakland.
Films. Yes, Simon Oakland, bless his heart, with the
least
favorite role. You can explain away at the end, but film works with a visual shorthand. And that's one of the cultural aspects of film. Just like you can have a movie like Almodovar, The Skin I Live In, that can be explicitly saying, hey, this is not what a trans person is, this is not how it creates it, but still it's visual shorthand, and people will take away from it what they will, because the conversation isn't there to back it up. And particularly wasn't there to back it up when Psycho was coming out.
Oh no. I mean, the only trans person in the public imagination at the time was Christine Jorgensen, who made a bit of a stir in the press when she had transitioned publicly. It galls me to this day that the most common profession among trans people in movies, to this day, when you know what that person does for a living, is serial killer.
Right.
So.
That's the common, what we see. They are unbalanced, and therefore this is how it manifests.
Piggyback on that, one thing before I forget, I just wanted to say, Rob, you were talking about the likeness of Anthony Perkins, and I busted out my Alfred Hitchcock clue game, because even it's not even his likeness on the Mr. Green as Mother in here. Not even there.
Like John Belushi there, I think.
It's a little Belushi. It's a little Walter Matthau. Although it can, just it is possible for it to be Mother in the bathroom with the kitchen knife.
Wow.
It's possible.
Wow.
But building on sexual minorities and gender minorities, one thing that I touched on earlier was something that really colors Anthony Perkins' performance going forward is his own relationship to his own homosexuality, specifically engaging in conversion therapy, undergoing conversion therapy over several years, including, it's reportedly, electroshock therapy was a part of that. And then seeing, I'm not saying this is why he's a smart actor, I'm sure he drew from his own experiences, but then seeing so many of the sequels being about, how do I wrestle with this demon inside? Will I pass this
particularly
demon
after
on?
going through therapy?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, will I pass this on to my kid? Maybe I'll kill my kid. Knowing that that's simmering in the background really breaks my heart when I start watching the sequels.
Yeah, and holding on to his sanity when everybody around him wants to rip it away from him.
Yep. We talked about the allegiance from Marion Crane over to Norman Bates. What's interesting is how we also see that lean into the Lila character trying to solve the mystery, and suddenly our allegiances shift to her, and we don't want Norman to get up there and catch her. Hitchcock does a great job of kind of like passing the ball back and forth between who are we rooting for in this moment.
I think there's a great moment when Sam Loomis comes to the hotel and Norman is busy sinking Arbogast in the swamp. That shot, I think, is the point where you lose it for Norman, because he just sort of looks at the camera and it's him.
We should probably talk about the score, since it's iconic and all.
There's a score in this movie. There's music.
Oh my God! Or the titles.
I said it at the beginning. I think Psycho is the Wizard of Oz of slasher movies, because not only because of its cultural footprint, but because it also has I think it's musical in its movements, like the way you could take the dialogue away, and you would have a sense of what's going on in the movie just with what the score is telling you, what Marion is feeling and what Norman is feeling. Bernard Herrmann, one of the most incredible composers of the 20th century and underrated in his influence on movies. I was just listening to one of his scores, and the Batman music started happening in the score, the Danny Elfman Batman score. And I was like, son of a bitch, you thief.
Well, it is funny that all you need is to make this gesture and go E, and we know exactly what you're talking about.
You don't have to have seen this movie for that to be true.
That's right.
There is a description of the first showing of Psycho to executives without the score in, I think it's in Stephen Rebello's The Making of Psycho. And it apparently just fell completely flat. Once the score was in place, it was absolutely transformative.
Yeah, that's true. Hilton Green, the assistant director, had told me that the first time they watched it didn't have the score, and they were like, what did we make? But that he was flabbergasted when they did put the Herrmann score in, which is the same thing with John Carpenter's Halloween. A lot of people said that didn't work without the score either. So it's fascinating. It's a character.
Is it true that that originally Hitchcock didn't want score for the murder scene for the shower scene?
That's right.
That's because then there's something later that he did where there was no score for a murder scene. I can't remember what it was.
That's Torn Curtain.
Thank you. Yes, the murder scene of Grobnik. Yeah.
And
The guy
Frenzy.
who just won't
And Frenzy.
Yep,
Yeah.
Frenzy is also right.
Oh God, the murder in Frenzy is it's an entire thing. We should put that
all in
aside.
good time. All in good time. Let's talk about the opening titles, because Saul Bass was involved in the storyboarding of the shower scene as well as those opening titles. And so both Herrmann and Saul Bass have left an enormous footprint on this film.
Huge.
Yeah, I think of those titles as like the evil twin of the titles in North by Northwest, because they both have sort of that's sort of sliding text and lines and rectilinear design.
This one is much more of an assault, though, I would say. And also the way the letters go, they're dismembered, which gives us a motif ahead of the story.
Well, I'll be bold enough to say, and this just dawned on me, is I think of all the Saul Bass stuff, especially with Hitchcock, as pop art, like the beginning of pop art. And I'll be bold enough to say I think it's like the whole inspiration for Mondo, like the Mondo posters and like just the unique designs, like just something that relates to the movie that you instantly recognize, but it's kind of a little off kilter. For many years, I had a shirt from, I think it was Fright Rags that did it, that was the lines that said, "We all go a little mad sometimes," and
which you are wearing you're wearing in the conversation with you and Tom Holland.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And Mick Garris on the Psycho 2 disc on the Arrow box set. Speaking of Psycho 2, we must lean forward into the sequel because it's 22 years later and Norman Bates is coming back home. I remember seeing that on HBO, and I had read Robert Bloch's Psycho 2 novel. And so it completely caught me off guard, because in that there is a certain character who you are told is the murderer at the end. And that character gets killed off in Psycho 2, the movie. And I was like, what is happening right now? But yes, it's very, as somebody alluded to earlier, you really can't do Psycho 2, the novel, as a movie because it wouldn't work for a variety of reasons. But yes, people's thoughts on Psycho 2 and maybe how you came to it for the first time. Rob, let's go ahead and kick things off, since you said the sequels were kind of what inspired you.
My vague memory is like 2 and 3 are like one movie to me. Like I discovered them at the same time, and they obviously are connected. They're basically one long version of the story. But I mean, I always loved Psycho 2. And I think the reason I loved it is because of Anthony Perkins' performance. And I think at that time, as a kid, I knew The Black Hole, which terrified me. And he was in that. It was more when I started Psycho Legacy and I went back to it, because at that point, it's when I watch these movies as a kid, I watch them as entertainment and all that. But then by the time I started Psycho Legacy, I had a little bit more knowledge of how films are made. And so I was watching it as a filmmaker. I was just really impressed with the script, again, because I know how the book goes. And it's like, wow, I talked to Tom Holland quite a lot about it. I mean, he went on to make some classic horror films, but Psycho 2 is really the one that made him, as he says, viable in Hollywood. I think it was just timing. Like, I think everybody was ready for Psycho 2 when it happened. My memory is that he told me the book had not been published yet. Like, basically the book and movie were almost simultaneous. Mm-hmm. And if somebody can correct me if I'm getting the timeline wrong, and that he read the book and said, yeah, I'm not doing this. And because basically the only part of the assignment was, we have to get Perkins back. Like, I don't know if we could do it without him. I had heard crazy rumors, like if he didn't say yes, they would have asked like Christopher Walken and there's a bunch of other people. Tom says that's not true at all. He says they would not have made it without Perkins. There are a lot of interesting people they wanted for Mary, the lead that ended up being Meg Tilly, and we can get into that later if you want. I think it's a masterclass in how to do a sequel, because it has a lot of reverence for the original. Richard Franklin, Australian director who made it, was a huge Hitchcock aficionado and expert. He apparently was the first person to get him to show up at, I think, at UFC, where he was going to school. And Richard Franklin was on the set of Topaz when he was shooting that. So he kind of had the, at least the touch of Hitchcock in some fashion. I mean, it's just a fun movie. It's definitely of its time, and they had to do that. Like, I remember the kids in the basement, they had to add that because Friday the 13th was what was happening at that moment. And Tom's like, I had to figure out a creative way to get teens killed in this movie. There's a lot to it I love. I'm very mixed on the twist ending. I love it because it fits perfectly with what Psycho set up, but then it became problematic going forward, trying to make that work. And the first thing that Charles Edward Poe did, the writer of the third one, was reversed it.
It's just like, nope, that didn't happen.
Yeah, which really pisses Tom off, but you know, whatever.
And I wasn't a fan either.
I will say, I was on a podcast with you before, a couple years ago, when we talked about Psycho 2. I re-listened to it, and I forgot that I was one of the few people who defended it as strongly as I did. I really like this movie. It does not have any business being as good as it is. It could have been a cash grab, and it does not feel like a cash grab. And when I rewatched it this time around, I really felt like it was in conversation with A Clockwork Orange, in that we have someone who's done atrocious things in the past, and they have atoned, and then we see other people trying to still hold him accountable after he's paid his price in society, which is a very different. It was a different experience for me. I am ride or die for it. I like it a lot. I buy that he is so fragile. Because also, being a clinical therapist, I'm very well aware of, granted, I don't think Bates Motel, I don't think he was getting great insurance at Bates Motel, so he probably went to a state-run hospital or whatnot. It's an unfortunate truth that, God, I'm putting this in quotes if people listen to this on the podcast later, cured. Like, people don't tend to be cured from certain things, and especially when you're in a place that has such a high turnover rate, when there's such demand for beds to be filled by other people who need them, people can sometimes be released, not cured. So I completely buy that he is a fragile man that is coming out of this place, and he's going back to, and I think Anthony Perkins his performance rides this balance of fragility throughout that I completely buy and adds to the heartbreak.
Doug?
Well, I'll admit, I kind of wish it didn't exist, because I think the original Psycho has such a perfect, ambiguous ending. But I think, Matthew, you're right. Anthony Perkins' performance is engaging, and it's not a bad movie if you look at it without the prejudice that I do bring into it.
Sure. And I mean, as you alluded, Rob, I mean, I don't think it could have been born had the slasher boom not been in full swing and people recognizing this is the grandparent of all slashers. Why not do it if Anthony Perkins will do it? I agree. I don't think it should have been done without Anthony Perkins being involved.
To Matthew's point, it very easily could have been a cash grab, but I think Tom and Richard really had reverence for the original. They really cared.
Sure.
And thankfully, the budget was at a point where nobody at Universal was paying attention to them. It's the only reason they got away with that movie, which, you know, might have been a hindrance towards Tony's third movie, where they were paying attention a lot.
I had a day, it's funny because I had a similar experience with all of the Child's Play movies and all of the Planet of the Apes movies, where I sat down on a couch and there was a marathon happening, and I just watched all of them, just kind of watched the sunset while I watched Psycho 2, 3 in the beginning. And I had a blast. I really loved Psycho 2. I agree with Doug in a lot of ways. Like, yeah, it's not necessary, but like Halloween, the sequels of Halloween aren't necessary either. But like, I kind of put a partition in my head between the first one and then like everything else. Yeah, I think it's really fun. I love Vera Miles. I love Meg Tilly. There's a lot more cinematic stuff happening than you would expect from what might have otherwise been a cash grab. That camera shot of Meg Tilly that like stays on her face, but it like tilts up into the like rafters almost. It's like just stuff like that where you're like, that's so Hitchcock.
I know that Richard Franklin and Tom Holland basically sat down and watched like every Hitchcock movie that had ever been made so that they could incorporate not so much aping of Psycho, but just kind of infusing it with a Hitchcockian quality and borrowing from all of the films. Christiana, what's your feeling on Psycho 2?
I'm not a fan of the Psycho or of the slasher movies of that era. And it feels like a slasher movie from that era, although a high-end one. I mean, it is shot by Dean Cundey, so It has a relationship with Halloween. I think that Anthony Perkins is terrific in it. I don't think that Meg Tilly is terrific in it, but I am not a fan of Meg Tilly. I think her sister had all the talent in that family.
You and Tony Perkins agree on that.
I was going to say, apparently, yeah, I didn't know this. I'm just recently finding out that apparently Tony Perkins was not a fan of Meg Tilly on that, which you would never guess based on their scenes together. They really work well together.
I had a conversation with somebody about Abel Ferrara's Body Snatcher movie, in which I basically said, okay, if Meg Tilly is your mom and she's been taken over by the pods, how would you know? Which is not very nice, I'm sure, but I mean, Franklin's a fine director. I mean, he's obviously studied Hitchcock. I mean, his previous film Road Games is basically Rear Window in a truck.
Yep.
I enjoyed it more when I rewatched it for this podcast a couple of days ago.
The idea that they would send him back to the very place where it all started, and that such a place is still just standing there 22 years later. I'm like, this is California. Land doesn't just sit idle in California. There's a lot of things I like about Psycho 2. And as Matthew alluded, there is a whole other episode that's dedicated to it and curtains. So feel free to stop by and hear that conversation. And Christiane, I'm going to throw the ball back to you because I know you are a huge champion of Psycho 3.
Yeah, I do love Psycho 3 because it doesn't look like the slasher movies from the late 1970s. It looks like an 80s movie. I think that the film has a more expansive conversation with Hitchcock than Psycho 2 does. I mean, it starts with Vertigo.
Yep.
I mean, the very first scene is the last scene in Vertigo, and you have echoes of Torn Curtain, you have echoes of Frenzy, you have lots of touchstones throughout the film.
The two quick things I want to throw about Psycho 3 is, number one, I love it because it's Psycho 1 from Norman's perspective. We know the twist. We're getting to see everything we saw in Psycho solely from his perspective. The second thing, and I strongly encourage this double feature, the biggest influence on Psycho 3 was Blood Simple. Tony Perkins was obsessed with Blood Simple and the Coen brothers, and he so much so that he screened it for the cast and crew saying, this is what we're doing, and got the same composer, Carter Burwell, who did Blood Simple, to do Psycho 3. So I didn't realize, until I was doing the documentary, I didn't realize that. And then I watched them back to back, and they are very similar movies in tone and style. And even I didn't, as a kid, I don't know if I found Psycho 3 funny. It's like darkly funny. But then I see Blood Simple and the Coen brothers, and I'm like, oh, no, Tony was trying to do somewhat of a dark comedy. It's definitely intended to be funny in the way that a Coen brothers movie is funny.
In terms of dark comedies, yeah, I remember one thing that I wrote down was, I wrote camp, ? When I think of camp, Susan Sontag defined it as failed seriousness. And there's sometimes I feel there's some failed seriousness in Psycho 3. In the beginning, when the one nun falls and hits her head on the bell as she's falling down, it's almost like, great, let's take Vertigo, and we'll start out Psycho 3 by doing Vertigo. She says, you need Jesus. I'm like, this nunnery needs OSHA. The entire opening scene when she is then hitchhiking and she gets a ride from the person, from Jeff Fahey, there's the altercation there. I also had, granted this would be more than 10 years later, that's the opening scene of Showgirls right there, the same motifs right there. I was like, oh, so I'm like, they didn't know it was camp at the time, but that's what I'm feeling. That aside, I'm not here to trash part 3 at all. I think there's so many interesting things about part 3. There's a lot of the DSM diagnostic criteria that will talk about delusions, that will talk about certain states of mental being, where it tells you what it should be, and then there's like an asterisk, and they're like, unless it has to do with religious or cultural beliefs. And I think there's such a fantastic fine line between what we consider psychosis and what we consider religion, what we consider divine intervention. And I think there's an amazing playoff here between the potential delusions, or which could have been caused by loss of blood, or religious fervor, or severe depression, that playing off of what Norman is going through. I think that is a wonderful dynamic between those two characters. One other element of the camp that brought into me is just when we're talking about Mother, I can't think of Diana without thinking of Mommy Dearest. So we have two characters that have mother figure histories that we're bringing and putting into the same movie.
Yeah, Psycho 3 was one that I loved Psycho 2 so much, so that when my friend and I went to see Psycho 3 in the theater, we had very much an expectation of, because I think one thing you can say about Psycho 2, with the exception of a few gory moments, is that it's classier than your average slasher. And I felt like Psycho 3 was not classy. It was very much leaning into kind of the trashiness of the 80s. And with the garish color and with the more violent set pieces. It's 1986. I've had my fill of slashers. I was hoping for more of Psycho 2. But again, coming back around to it and appreciating it for what it is, as you say, Rob, like there's so many great touches that are, you can see where he was cherry picking from Blood Simple. We've got a director here, Anthony Perkins, who wants to make good. He wants to do right by this character that he has both been served by and trapped by. And that's why he agreed to do the film, was so that he could direct. And you see him really trying to do some impressive and audacious set pieces, camera moves, and things like that. And when I pull back and just kind of like take out my thoughts about the Psycho franchise, and I just look at it from purely a filmmaking standpoint, this is somebody who's really trying to show what he can do. And it's unfortunate that the script doesn't necessarily serve him in that regard. I think a lot of critics went after that. And also just the tone being so different, because what you said, Rob, like they are coming right on the heels of one another narratively. And for the tone to be so different, I think that really threw a lot of people. And so it didn't sit well with critics or audiences, and it kind of faded away.
I think it's just a timing thing, honestly, because I think now it's more appreciated for what it is in that moment in time, because Tony Perkins had a very, very unique, interesting European sensibility. He loved those films. And I just looked it up to make sure I didn't get my math wrong, but he loved Ken Russell. And he had already done Crimes of Passion at this point. So I definitely see traces of Coen Brothers and Crimes of Passion directly into Psycho 3. And, you see it now. I think, again, it was a different time period where people like Tony Perkins would get typecast for this character. And I think it was similar in terms of directing, because he only got to do one other feature after this called Lucky Stiff, impossible to find now. I think he was a very underrated director if you look at what he's doing at Psycho 3. And I wish he had the chance to do more. And he also co-wrote with Sondheim
Last of Sheila.
There you go. Yes.
Last of Sheila. So what a great fun film that is.
I feel like we missed out on having him be behind the camera more.
Rob, I'm curious if you have any insight on this. Every time I watch Psycho 3, it's been a handful of times now, it always feels compromised to me. It always feels much in the way like when I watch Halloween 2, Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. I watch that and I can't help thinking, you know what, the Akkad stepped in, and everything in this film is telling me that this is all Laurie's delusion, and she's the one who's killing everybody. But they're never in scenes together. They're never in the same frame. But then all of a sudden they're like, no, we need Michael Myers as the killer. And so that's how it's wrapped up. That's how it feels to me. This one feels to me like it's not Norman. And they were intending it maybe to be Jeff Fahey even.
That was definitely an underlining thing, but yes, it was always meant to be Norman, and from Norman's perspective. It's from what I understand, based on conversations with the writer Charles Edward Pogue, it's not compromised really. The thing with Tony, and I'm just hypothesizing here, is again, he had a different sensibility. He was more interested in character study and doing very cool visual things. Maybe not necessarily as interested in the script or what the story was, or even adhering to what happened in 2. He had also, by the way, sued Universal for Psycho 2 because they didn't pay him what he was owed. Somehow the movie was in the red, even though it was a huge, massive hit. And that was really the only way he got to direct 3, is basically he blackmailed them into it. It's like, well, if you want me to come back, only if I direct. So I think there's a lot going on in the movie. I think it's a great directorial debut.
I think there are 3 things in Psycho 3 that I take away from it every time I watch it. The first is the ice chest scene, which is mordantly funny, while also being absolutely grotesque. And I think Hitchcock would have really appreciated it. The second thing is the use of the Cupid statue which is in all of the movies. It's not something they put in there for Psycho 3. It's just waiting there like a bomb to go off for 3 movies. And then it does in the most horrible way for Norman. Third thing that I love is the use of Norman's taxidermy, because we have that wonderful scene at the beginning where he's stuffing birds and suddenly he sees that he's stuffing his mother's arm. And then at the end, in the last shot, which is, a variant of the last shot of the first film, he pulls the stuffed arm out from under his jacket, even after he's told the sheriff, at last I'll be free. And I love all of those touches, and I love the way that it sends the audience to the parking lot with that image.
And I love that nobody frisked this guy. Seriously.
Yeah, that too. Oh, and the other thing, then this is true about Psycho 2 and Psycho 3, is that it is conspicuous that neither of those films uses the Bernard Herrmann score.
My vague understanding, and this is from talking to writer and then everyone involved in those sequels, is that I think it was so iconic, like so connected to Psycho, that when they were doing their respective movie, I don't think they thought about it that hard. I think they just thought, what do we do you can't use that theme again. Yeah. Let's do our own thing. Mick Garris was, the first going into Psycho 4. He's like, why didn't anybody do the Bernard Herrmann score? And they're like, is there any reason I can't use it? And they're like, no. And he's like, well, then I'm going to use it. Like, I don't understand why nobody else did. So I just think it was literally what they were thinking. They weren't thinking that hard about it at the time. It was more of, let's do our own thing. And to just one final thought on Psycho 3, I think that ending shot is a studio note with the arm in the car, if I'm not mistaken.
Just to have
maybe it might be in one of the commentaries or something like that. If there's any compromise, it's that they had to end it with, a sequel tease or whatever.
Well, and then if we do talk about Psycho 4, which unfortunately we must, sorry, did I say that?
I will defend it, damn it.
Good. Well,
I will too.
We do hear our Bernard Herrmann score return in full swing, but they also let Norman out again, which I'm just kind of like, right from the get-go, I'm like, Joseph Stefano, who wrote the script, what are you doing? Like, do better. But anyway, so Psycho 4, the beginning, has a two-headed storyline where we have Norman, who has been released. He is now married, and he is calling in to a radio talk show that is discussing matricide. And through that story, we get a flashback of his early relationship with his mother, played by Olivia Hussey, and then the young Norman is played by Henry Thomas of E.T. fame and Cloak and Dagger fame. So yes, let the defense begin.
I mean, I saw it in a TV marathon with 2 and 3, so they're all kind of one big memory to me in some ways. But 4, I'll say, there's another partition between 3 and then 4. It's like an odd kind of postscript or like epilogue to the other 3, I think. It's why I sort of accept the weird structure of it, that he's in this weird 90s suburban home, which creeps me out for some reason. I love the location of the hotel and the house so much that I think I'll watch absolute dreck just to live in that world a little bit longer. I love the period stuff of the flashbacks with Norman, particularly the one where he kills the girl in the car. I just love there's fireworks going on and it's very 50s and very colorful, and I like a lot of that stuff. It's not good, but like I said, I do like just to live in that world. I think it's what led me into finally watching Bates Motel.
Well, the fireworks are an allusion to Catch a Thief, because you have his girlfriend / seductress saying, I know you want to touch them, and then the fireworks go off. That's absolutely To Catch a Thief, where Grace Kelly says the same things and the fireworks go off.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of the carnival scene in just in the atmosphere, the carnival scene in Strangers on a Train as well.
I love this movie because it was the first one I was able to look forward to. Like at that point, the other ones existed. So this was the first one. And I don't know, I'm a kid. So it's like, oh my God, there's a new Psycho coming and I can't wait to see it. I also, at that time, and again, your unformed 14-year-old mind wants to understand the backstories of these characters. So, again, I can recognize now as an adult that maybe it's not great, but at 14, oh my God, this is genius explaining how it all happened. So I really love that. I will say the stuff that stands out, the reason, well, Perkins is great as always. I mean, he could do this in his sleep. To defend Joseph Stefano, technically it's supposed to just be a sequel to 1, so it's not that he got out again. But Mick Garris, being a fan like us, was like, well, we can't just ignore everything. Like we have to honor fans of all of it. So let's keep it vague enough that we can say the other 2 happened, but not really have to prove it. I think the thing that's, for me, the reason for the movie to exist is I think Henry Thomas and Olivia Hussey are so good. Like that dynamic, the way that they both look and act as the characters. Henry is very underrated as another. I mean, you can't see anybody other than Anthony Perkins in that role, and yet I think having Anthony tell the story kind of makes you forgive it and go along with it. So I like a lot of it. I like that Joseph Stefano got to scratch his itch in terms of what he wanted the backstory to be. He probably thought about it for many years and saw the sequels and was like, no, it should be this. So there's a lot to like about it. I also think it's one of the best directed things that Mick did. There's a lot of style to it. Later he was doing things like The Stand, where he, for over 100 days, where he didn't have time to like really do cool stuff. But on this, he did. And again, timing. The only reason this movie exists is because they were building the house at Universal Florida. Yeah. So it was meant to be a tourist attraction. Hey, they're making a new Psycho. So, and for Showtime, it was an original Showtime. I have a picture of me at that time at the one from Psycho 4 in Orlando, which is now long gone. I've gotten to walk the grounds of the one here in California, which is just kind of surreal, even though it's all fake.
I know.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Bates house is actually like modeled on the Addams Family house from the Charles Addams cartoons, correct?
That's what I heard in the commentary. Yeah.
Yeah. Not as big as it looks in the movies either. That always I'm like, it ruins the illusion, but I love it. I love it.
Forced perspective. They purposely built it smaller so it would look bigger and more imposing. Yeah.
Well, and they were going with the horizontal line of the motel and the vertical line of the house. No. And I agree, Rob. I think because I wasn't a big fan of this when it first came out, but coming back around to it, I'm really appreciative of the care that Garris takes with it. There's some really great visual set pieces. I have issues with the script on many levels, but one of the things that kind of saved me, I think it was in the liner notes for the new Arrow box set, was they talk about how, because it's a flashback, all of this is through Norman's lens. And so he sees his wife, yes, there's a Freudian slip. He sees his mother as beautiful Olivia Hussey with an English accent. It's just like, why? Because that was I'm like, why is Olivia Hussey playing his mom? But again, the fact that it's shot through his lens and all of these things happen, he sees someone who is like a younger version of himself rather than injecting a true younger Tony Perkins. It's a variation on Tony Perkins. So that kind of actually helped me reframe my viewing of the movie, and I like it a lot more. I think it's still a little bit of a hackneyed trope of getting him to call in and give his story. I feel like that was a bit of a reach. I did like it more this time around. Matt?
I'm complicated feelings about this movie. I think the performances are really interesting. I think Olivia Hussey does some really she makes some interesting choices throughout. Tonally, I got that same vibe, Aaron, that it was, the flashbacks are from, it's an unreliable narrator. So that's why maybe you have the one vixen type character styled right out of Lolita. I was like, okay, because it seemed a little heavy-handed in some points. I think Mick is doing some interesting things. I had seen Critters 2 before this in theaters, and that was actually, I loved Critters 2 when I was a kid. And then after this is when he did Sleepwalkers, which I think, while is also flawed, might be a superior incest movie. I like it. I really enjoy it. One thing, God, I was going through Letterboxd, looking at different reviews that people had said, and the one thing that stood out to me most was, man, tickle fight boners are the worst. Like, yeah, bet $1.
Yeah.
One thing that rubs me, tickle fight boners. One thing that rubs me the wrong way, I did not plan that, is the script. There's an odd touch of misogyny that it starts out from the get-go that doesn't seem supported by any of the directorial or acting choices. It's a very odd. You balance that out by having someone as strong and commanding as CCH Pounder carrying so many of the scenes. Like, I guess that's how you can balance it out. But that it was just such an odd tone, and I'm like, what is this movie going for? What is it trying to say? And even with the final girl of sorts, like his wife, are we rooting for her? She tricked him into getting pregnant. Yeah. It's a weird tonally. The script didn't quite work for me. That being said, I'm glad people got jobs, and I'm glad people did interesting choices while they had their jobs.
Well, again, I think the stuff that works the best is the backstory stuff, and maybe not so much the present day stuff, which is fine. But the thing I find most interesting about this movie, and just in general when it comes to storytelling and backstories of characters, and which is, it's still vague in Psycho 4, whereas they definitely define it in Bates Motel, is the whole question of the movie is nature versus nurture. Which one made Norman the way he is? And it's still, there's no answer in Psycho 4. It's kind of both, I guess. Bates Motel, the show, it's very much nature. He was always going to be that way. David Lynch never liked to answer the question. He thought the question was more compelling than the answer. And that's how I feel about Norman is I liked that they kept it vague enough that is it nature or nurture? What do you think?
One of the things that bothers me about this film is the way that it leans into the idea that Norman actually is trans. Yeah, his mom finds his little catalog, but is that because he's wanking to pictures of naked girls, or is he like shopping for himself? Mm-hmm. There are numerous instances in this film where Norma asks Norman, "Are you a girl?" And basically tries to force femme him at a couple of points. I also don't really like the way that the first half of the film doesn't really have an effect on the second half of the film. Halfway through the film, you're done with the radio people, and then you go off to Norman as the BTK killer.
I think that speaks to that disconnect too, Christiane. I'm so glad you brought that up about the emasculation and the forced feminization and how it's being tied to one being less than, and there's some complicated gender politics going on there that made me feel icky, and not in a way that I felt was intentional or that I wanted to participate in.
Well, it's definitely transphobic.
It is, and equating a fetishization of underwear towards gender identity, and again, it's confusing things in ways that
it's so broad and silly and like I the way even just like behavior, mental health is handled. It's like, even Psycho 1, it's like, it's such a, you would be able to speak to this misunderstanding of mental health and like how things like that work, correct? I mean, like
absolutely. Yeah. And what we thought it was back then was just different than how we talk about it now. One thing that this movie with the disconnect that also makes me that makes this movie, this entry, the least favorite for me of the franchise, is that with prequels in general, it can be hard to keep the stakes high because at some point they have to reach a certain status quo.
Yeah.
And while it's interesting to hear the backstory, it's also weird because it doesn't immediately inform what's happening when he's chasing his wife around. And they say that, I'm going to kill her, but it doesn't feel like the same kind of suspense that you would get in a Hitchcockian way, which is you show the audience that there's a bomb, and then you hide it and you're waiting for the bomb. Because then by the time the bomb is going to go off, you're like, but do I care about the people in the room? Should it go off?
Right. Maybe that bomb should go off. Let's quickly just chat about the Gus Van Sant 1998 remake, because I think that was one that was kind of set up to fail. It was Gus Van Sant coming off of Good Will Hunting. And I love the fact that he took all of his Good Will Hunting goodwill and said, I want to make a not shot for shot, because I hate it when people say that. It's a scene for scene remake. It's basically using Joseph Stefano's original script and doing the movie again with a different cast.
It was meant to be shot for shot, for sure.
Right.
I can talk about this.
But it doesn't become shot for shot. Like there are definitely camera angles and things that have changed markedly. But anyway, it sounds like there's been a little bit of a reappraisal, but maybe not by everybody.
I do think it's a pointless film. I mean, you're just setting yourself up to fail by remaking Psycho. You might as well remake Citizen Kane, for crying out loud.
Why don't they remake Citizen Kane?
Well,
where's the color? I mean, come on. Anyway, go ahead.
There actually is a remake of Citizen Kane. It was done for Animaniacs on TV. That having said that, I mean, I watched it last night. I had forgotten so much about it. I saw it when it was in theaters. I did not know that it had been shot by Christopher Doyle, who was most famous for working with Wong Kar-wai on Happy Together and In the Mood for Love, and most of his work is in Asia, and this film is gorgeous. It is just, I mean, it's got saturated colors. It's just got a sort of a gauzy romantic feel to the saturation of it. And it's not shot for shot. I noticed a number of places where it's not shot for shot. It actually deviates a little bit. I mean, some scenes are actually a little bit sped up. The psychiatrist's exegesis at the end is not as long in this film, and it's different. It omits, a discussion of Norman's sexuality. My main issue with this film is that I don't like either of the central performances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think Anne Heche is just entirely too twitchy to really work within the framework of the film. I kind of think the same thing of Vince Vaughn, although I think Vince Vaughn could actually play Bloch's Norman nowadays. But then you get to the other side of the shower scene, and suddenly you're in the middle of a Paul Thomas Anderson film. William Macy and Julianne Moore and Philip Baker Hall. I really like William Macy. You're going to recast Arbogast. William Macy is a great choice, and I think he does a great job. I don't think Viggo Mortensen's accent works for Sam Loomis. Julianne Moore comes off as a little bit more unlikable as Lila than Vera Miles did. They've redesigned the Bates Motel and the Bates house.
Well, it's an interesting movie in that it gives us and certainly scholars a chance to compare. It's written about a lot in film journals, whereas the sequels you've been talking about are not a great deal. That's why Rob had to make his movie. But this remake of Psycho constantly referenced in books and articles. And, is it as powerful? No, it's not. But it's how well, what other two movies do we have in film history almost to compare in this way? If you think, if you argue the shower scene should be done in black and white, so we're not, as Hitchcock said, distracted by red. Well, here's a comparison to look at.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it fascinating in that way. I don't think it's a great movie, but quite an interesting experiment by a great director.
I mean, a couple of us on this panel come from a theater background, and the idea of recasting is just something that's not foreign to me. Right. So I actually like the idea of seeing someone else play Norman Bates, seeing someone else play Arbogast. Is Vince Vaughn, my favorite Norman Bates? No, but he might be somebody else's. And I think that's okay. It's okay to give people that opportunity. And I like the fact that they stuck with the same script so that we really are, as you said, Doug, we're in a position where we can weigh back and forth and see, I like this, I don't like that, this is better, or I prefer this. I think it's an experiment. And I think that was all it was intended to be. Gus Van Sant was like, I want to attempt a formal experiment of what would it be like to try to remake a film, because when you're making a movie, you don't know how it's going to end up. Here, they had a final result that they were kind of working backwards from.
Yeah.
And I think I think it's an interesting thing. I don't know that it's necessarily as satisfying for an audience, but I think for a creative, as an experiment, I think it was a worthwhile thing to do. Whether it needed to get into multiplexes, I don't know.
Well, I have a lot to add, if you don't mind.
Great, please.
I saw it in theaters. I couldn't wait. I was so excited. It didn't work for me then. It still doesn't work for me. I will say that William H. Macy is the best thing about it. He's the only casting that I agree with. And now knowing the creatives involved, none of them take this as seriously as anybody examining it, except maybe Vince Vaughn and Anne Heche did. I was fortunate enough to work on the Dexter podcast, and my friend Scott was the writer producer, And one of the editors on Dexter, he's like, "Oh, you have to meet Amy." And he's like, "You're going to love Amy because Amy edited Gus Van Sant's Psycho."
Oh, wow.
And so he walked me over, and Amy Donaldson, shout out. I love her dearly, and she's a great person. And I was like, "You need to tell me everything about this movie, about editing it." And so Scream Factory did the Psycho remake as a Blu-ray. And there's a commentary from the time with Vince Vaughn and Gus Van Sant. And it's painful because they are so serious, and all they do is talk about how every decision they made is better than the original. So it's infuriating. However, there's a second commentary with me and Amy sitting on my couch right here watching it. And I strongly suggest listening to it because, well, the first thing is, yes, the assignment was shot for shot. But as she explained, you know what? Pacing in what year this was, 96 or whatever.
98. Yeah.
Pacing in 98 was very different than 1960. So she's like, we just couldn't. Like, I edited it shot for shot, and it was so boring. It just moved so slow. So she's like, we just decided we had to edit it a little bit more like.
Yeah, I noticed it's like 10 minutes shorter than the original.
Because they just had to. They literally, and I mean on set, they timed it. I mean, again, that was the experiment. They timed it. If an actor didn't get it on the right timing as the original, they redid it until they did. But then when they got into the editing room, they're like, "Oh shit, this doesn't work."
Yeah, it doesn't work.
And I mean, they made decisions that I think are hilarious. And again, people examine it so seriously. For example, the shower scene, and I'm pretty sure she explains it. She's like, the shower scene, I cut it shot for shot, did not work. It was terrible. It just didn't, for whatever reason, we just couldn't get it to work. And then at the same time that they're editing, they made a teaser trailer for the Psycho remake, which I love. I think their teaser trailer is awesome. And in the teaser trailer, inexplicably, there's like these weird shots of like Nine Inch Nails videos and Rob Zombie and stuff like that. And they're in the editing room and they're just like, why won't the shower scene work? And Gus Van Sant just like, hey, you know how they do those like weird shots in the trailer? Let's just put those into the shower scene.
I knew it. I was going to ask you about that when you're. Oh my god.
So that's to me, that's hilarious to me. Is that that's as much thought as they put into it. It's like, maybe this will make it work. I don't know.
God.
But look, they had a great time making it. For Amy, it was her first theatrical feature film that she got to edit, and she's gone on to have an incredible career since. Yeah, I mean, again, interesting experiment. I don't think it works at all. However, its existence, I think, is pivotal to making. It's a necessary step to the Bates Motel show. I don't know if people would have accepted remaking it again had it not been the blow cushioned by the existence of the 98 Psycho. I think by the time they got to the show, I don't think it was blasphemy to remake it again. Okay. So, and I like the show a lot. I think they did a great job as an alternate timeline for what that story could be.
I like to think of the remake of Psycho as somebody took the corpse of Psycho and buried it in a pet cemetery, and it came back wrong.
Very accurate.
Never comes back the same way, does it?
Yeah. Nope. Mac, what were your thoughts on the remake?
I would have been, I think, 12 when this movie came out, so I was pumped because of the Scream wave, and I Know What You Did Last Summer, and all of that. I think I liked it when I first saw it because I was a dumb kid, and I had a poster for it, that like a stick 'em on the wall on a window poster, and that poster is really good. I do like that poster of the hand, but the movie's terrible. I every now and then I watch it. I put both movies on, like I put the original on a TV and the remake on my iPad, and I watch them together and watch how one gets ahead and then the other one catches up, and it's very like all that stuff. It's so 90s. It reminds me. I think you could put this Psycho and the Planet of the Apes remake together as movies that are made that are so cynically made, because it's like there's no passion, there's no like, it's not a passion project, it's like a can we do this? And in Tim Burton's case, it's like, can we do this but better? Yeah. And I think that's an attitude that's not good going into a movie, like making a movie is like, and I think that's all over the 90s. By the time you get to like King Kong, the Peter Jackson King Kong remake, it's like there's actual love. And like, even whatever you think of that movie, there is like real love for the original in that movie, where it's not in Psycho and the original in the Planet of the Apes remake. And boy, those yellow headphones that Julianne Moore wears are distracting.
Matt?
Okay, are you guys ready?
I'm ready.
Because I'm going to celebrate the hell out of Gus Van Sant's Psycho.
Sing it.
First off, I have the original soundtrack with music from and inspired by this. And when you talk, and you were saying, Mac, about hearing Batman in Herrmann's score, and this is Danny Elfman rearranging the original score. It does get sampled in one of the songs that's in here, but it's not a great. The original songs, I mean, I think the only song that actually shows up in the movie is "Living Dead Girl," maybe the Rob Zombie one.
It's on the radio when she's like at the car shop.
Yeah. I think this movie is a great experiment because we see how many times how many times have we seen people take on these same words of a King Lear or a Romeo or a Juliet, any of these things. And what an experiment. What if we took that same idea that we take with a script, for plays, and we use it with a screenplay? What if we do that? Why not?
Right.
Because it was purported to be a shot-for-shot remake. What's really interesting is what are the changes that have been made and why have they been put there? I think it's the most distracting one for me has to do with the headphones. It's when they're going to go back to the hotel and Julianne Moore says, "Wait, let me get my Walkman." And I'm like, okay, cool, Julianne Moore, cool. A little bit of insight, Christiane, this adds to, I guess, honestly, politics of the late 90s. You mentioned that Julianne Moore comes across a little more unlikable than Delilah in the first version. I absolutely agree. I remember in press at the time, Anne Heche being interviewed, and Anne Heche being very excited because the scuttlebutt, or at least when they were talking, because they never really filmed together, was that Julianne Moore was going to play this role as a lesbian. And so Anne Heche was very, quote unquote, very excited to see Julianne Moore's lesbian, which if she waited a few more years, she'd see it a few times over in Oscar caliber performances. So the thing with this is Psycho, the original one, is built on suspense. We don't know what's going to happen, and the twist happens. It's fantastic. Gus Van Sant is no dummy. Gus Van Sant is an artist who knows what he's doing. He is making choices for reasons. He knows that if we go into Psycho, there's no twist for Psycho. We know it. We know it already. We're going in there with meta knowledge of Psycho. So why do this? There's one point where they use a shot when Anne Heche is driving through Bakersfield or something, and she passes a movie poster for 6 Days, 7 Nights, a movie that she's in. So there's this meta. It's a movie that we know it's a movie with people that are in movies that are within the movie. What are we doing here? So it makes me think back to one quote that I heard from Gus Van Sant when they said, "Why did you do this?" And he said, "I did this so nobody else would." I think let's talk about not what this says about, okay, is it a successful Psycho movie? What does this say about remakes? What does this say about, do we do this in Hollywood? I do think that he completely saved us from getting another remake. Because I mean, not too far down the line, we'd get another Prom Night, we'd get another, the horror movies would be turned out and remade. But I definitely think he saved us from getting like a Casablanca with Jordan Padalecki.
It's not even like a total remake of the script, because there is actually a line that they added in the remake that I do like. It's when she's in her boss's office and she's trying to leave. The businessman who's there that's like hitting on her through the scene. When she leaves, he goes, "You could maybe use a weekend in Vegas," and she goes, "I'm going to spend the weekend in bed." And that's the line she says in the movie, in the original too. Yep. But in the remake, they add, "That's a better playground than Vegas." And I was like, that's not a bad pervy.
Well, if that's actually in the original script, and if you watch the original film, you can see him turning back. He's going to make that comment to the bank manager, and they cut it. That was actually filmed for the 1960 version, but I didn't know that until I'd seen the remake and I'd heard that, and then I went back and I was like, oh, you can see right where they cut it, because they thought that might be a bit too much.
I think I watched the remake enough as a kid that when I now watch the original, that I always expect that line to be there, because I do like that line, and it's not there.
One choice that he made that I think is not as strong as the original is the very end. At the end of the first movie, we go from Norman's smile to that superimposition of the mother for just a moment, and then the crane pulling the car out of the swamp, and that's it. you're left to struggle with all those images. In the Van Sant, it does those, but then gently goes back and we see traffic and we're restored to a status quo. And I think it just does a disservice to the energy and how upset we are at the end.
No, that's great. That's a great, because I remember seeing that as well with the remake. And I had a different takeaway in that I kind of liked how life goes on, even though people get murdered and shoved into swamps. It's like, and then you pan over and the next story's right next door. I agree that, the ending of the original is so much more powerful because you are left with, oh my God, like,
make of this?
What just happened?
I was curious about that too, because while we're stuck with the images and at the end of the original, that's really powerful. This one just lingers, and it's over a bog, a stagnant body of water. I'm like, is there almost like a stench of death that we're just kind of left with? It was unsettling in a different way. And I will say, God bless Robert Forster for taking on the role of least favorite person in a Psycho movie and delivering that monologue in such a fantastic way.
Let's go ahead and circle back around. Some final thoughts on, and this has been a great conversation. Thank you all so much for bringing your insights and enthusiasm. But final thoughts on Psycho and the Psycho legacy, if you'll allow me to borrow your title, Rob.
The cultural footprint of this movie is all over the place. Like we said, children on playgrounds somehow know this whole franchise is amazing. Anthony Perkins, amazing score. Hitchcock, like, we don't have parts of American culture without all this. So, like, watch it all, enjoy it.
I'm gonna bounce back to you, Matt.
I do highly recommend people check out Bates Motel. I think in terms of it being a remake of Psycho, it spans over 3 episodes, but it's really majorly only 1 episode, featuring Rihanna as Marion Crane. In what I like to refer to as, me and my trusty umbrella, Ella. Hey. What Gus Van Sant, if you look at that as an unsuccessful remake of Psycho, I think it learned from that and did things better. You didn't just have someone Anthony Perkins could fill up a doorway, so you just give someone who can fill up a doorway, like, what's his name, Vince Vaughn? That's not the point. You get someone, you return it to the boyish and the innocence and the anxiety. I think that was a really interesting way to go about doing it, and to make it a little bit more of a surprise, because again, we're going in there already with meta knowledge of what the script is going to be like. I think they do a good job of twisting it a bit, even if it does at one point Rihanna takes a golf club and bashes in someone's windows, and I'm like, now we're just in a Rihanna video. Great, I'm not mad, just not where I thought it was going to go. I think this is a really interesting story that's being told here. What I love about it is the conversation we can have and where it goes. I think that's where franchises are more successful. When people call things problematic, I love that, because it means it creates conversation. We should be talking about these. If they were safe, that's lovely, but look how amazing this can be. So anyone who's listening right now, check out any of these entries into the franchise, even the ones we didn't necessarily champion. I think you will get something to talk about, and it will make you think about something in a way you didn't before.
Thank you, Matthew. Christiana.
I sometimes think of Psycho as one of the 4 or 5 most influential horror movies ever made. And I think that actually minimizes its case. I was watching a video that Eddie Muller, the film noir guy from TCM, was talking about where the end of the film noir era actually is, and he points to Psycho, because Psycho starts as film noir and ends up as a horror movie. It's the first shot in the modern horror movies that would come to dominate the genre in the 60s and 70s. I can't necessarily say that Psycho is solely responsible for that, because 1960 is one of the best years for horror movies ever.
Yep.
Just listening to us talk, I mean, you can trace the influence everywhere throughout the culture. It is just saturated.
It's a turning point in film history too. I mean, a lot of people look at this as where the production code really crumbled, and then looking at how the 60s, both the country and the film industry changed. This is the turning point in many ways of all of that.
Rob?
Well, my final thought, I know we've been going a while, is I'm just going to do show and tell really quick. I'm going
to blow Rob up big quick so we can see all his gear.
All right. I'll start with this. I know you guys probably have books of this sort. This was like from the library, where basically they would take movies and do all of the shots So you could relive the movie in the days before video, but this is the original Psycho one.
Yep.
Love this.
I have the Frankenstein version of that.
Yes. A Psycho video disc. Does anyone remember this forgotten format? I don't have
Is
the
that one?
player.
Is that one of the magnetic ones?
Yes, this is the
Disco Vision.
Yeah, RCA video disc. Also forgotten format is the original. Sorry, the original laser disc, which came in this fancy box set.
Ah, I have that.
Cool.
We'll go to some physical media. It took years before they would actually package the Psycho movies together. So this is the first one I could find, which was a UK box set, and it was the first time that you can get all 4 movies together on DVD. Then of course there's my documentary, The Psycho Legacy, through Shout Factory. I think these are still available on Amazon. Nice. My heart is in the right place. This is my first film. There's a lot of rookie mistakes, a lot of technical things. I would remake this in a heartbeat if I could, but it is
but in color.
In color. Really quick, here's other versions of Psycho Legacy. This is the UK DVD. I don't know if you can see that. This is my favorite. This is the German Blu-ray, which just has this crazy house thing. And by the way, we shot it in SD, intended as a special feature for maybe a DVD. So there's no real high def version of this documentary. French. Psycho Legacy in French. Also in France, they paired it with his name is Jason. His Friday 13th documentary, which is kind of fun. And this is God, I hope I don't get it wrong. Is this Spanish? This is a recent Blu-ray release of Psycho 2.
Nice.
It's really cool. They are using his likeness there. Maybe they can get away with it. Let's see. Psycho 2 I showed before. This is the Arrow one.
That looks like the what's that the Omen poster from last year.
Omen.
Yeah,
First Omen.
First Omen. Yep. This is the new Arrow 4K box set, which has all 4 movies. Excellent.
And an amazing that booklet there is filled with a couple of amazing essays. One is on Ed Gein and the crimes that inspired Bloch, and then there's a terrific kind of tour through the entire franchise. That is fantastic. What is that?
So this is my favorite thing. This is a limited edition German box set done by a company called Turbine. I'm still in touch with them and they're great. But this is what, when I made the documentary, this is all I ever wanted to exist, was something that had everything. And so this literally has all 4 movies. It has my documentary. It has the Bates Motel TV pilot with Bud Cort. It's even got 7852, the documentary about the shower scene. And inside, bear with me.
Stop making Psycho movies now because Rob's done. Rob has his final collection.
I welcome more of them. This comes with the hotel registry, which is kind of funny.
Oh,
that's the
cool.
book. What other goodies? There's a lot of really fun stuff in here. Sorry, there's a Do Not Disturb postcard from the Bates Motel, lobby cards, stationery, posters, and hold on one second. The last thing I want to show you, which is worth it. Yes, it is we were talking about the tragedy of Marion in the first movie and her relationship with Sam. There's an actual reproduction of the letter that Sam writes to her, which is basically him saying to her, "I'm sorry, I was wrong. We'll make it work one way or the other," meaning that she didn't even have to do what she did. And then that's what the discs look like. So that's my Psycho Legacy collection, and I really appreciate everybody that was on this panel, and thank you to Aaron for having us. This was a great time.
Thank you. Wow. Well, that was a great way to wrap things up. Rob, do you have any final thoughts just on the films themselves or on the original in particular?
I mean, the original is a masterpiece, and I hope, for me, it was a gateway into the films of Alfred Hitchcock, and then basically films that inspired Alfred Hitchcock. I think it's a beautiful film school. The sequels are more, for me, it's all about the original. The sequels and everything they've done since is more for popcorn entertainment. Sure, I don't wish they didn't exist because they led me to the Psycho, but I don't hold them in the same regard as the original. I mean, I love them all for different reasons, but no, I think you know, as Matt said, I think it starts great conversations, and that's what all great cinema should do.
I mentioned, I think backstage and maybe on the recording, that was a while ago when we started, but that I think we kind of take Psycho for granted these days, and maybe we don't go back and watch it from start to finish. And that was a real treat for me to sit down with it again, because you do appreciate it as a film as opposed to kind of the icon of cinema that it has become. That's kind of what I like to do in general with this channel, is to bring these classics back that you have kind of taken as rote. We accept them as part of the culture. But when was the last time you actually sat down and watched it from start to finish? And that was something that was really exciting. I'd seen all of these movies before, but I hadn't seen them this close together, and I certainly hadn't seen them recently. So thank you all for the opportunity to sit down with them and then to sit down with you and have this amazing conversation. Looking forward to having you all on again very soon. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.